Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to pick up on chapter 19, talking now about what happens when a party does not perform in accordance with the contract and the distinction between the failure to perform being deemed a material breach versus a breach but still substantial performance under the contract and the consequences for those various characterizations. Some key questions as we go through this chapter to think about: is the breach material? In which case the non-breaching party's performance will be totally excused. Or is it not a material breach, in which case the breaching party may still receive some value under the contract, subject to some sort of offset to be determined by the court. Related question: if you think the other party is in breach or is going to breach, what can you do? Or what should you do? And in that vein, we'll talk about some doctrines like anticipatory repudiation and adequate assurances that help parties establish as a matter of law that the other party is in fact in breach. There's a few things that you really want to be wary of as a party to a contract. First of all, there is some danger in doing or saying nothing. Why? Because of the doctrines that we talked about in our last class, waiver and estoppel. Because if you think that the other party is breaching and you say nothing about it or do nothing about it, then the other party could make an argument that they thought you had waived your right to assert that they were in breach, and that if they continued acting under the contract to their detriment, that you are estopped from a claim that they are in breach. The other thing, though, that you do want to worry about is if you just presumptively declare, oh, you're in breach, other party, now I don't have to perform. And the court looks at the situation and decides, no, the other party wasn't breaching the contract. Now you are the one who has breached, and you might have to pay the other party damages. So you want to really balance out the providing the other party notice, making the other party communicate with you about what's going wrong under the contract, and establishing that trail for the court to follow, that this was the language of the contract, you believe the other party was in breach, you reached out to the other party to let them know about the breach, as we'll talk about in this chapter, give them an opportunity to cure the breach, and only then are you declaring or seeking to have a court declare that the other party is in breach and that your performance obligations no longer exist under the contract. I would encourage you all to bookmark page 773 of your text, where it has R2K 241, circumstances significant in determining whether a failure is material. Because this is really the analysis that you're going to want to go through anytime you are alleging that the other party is in breach of contract. So let's look at this carefully and think about what sort of things parties should be doing in connection with each of these factors in R2K 241. In determining whether a failure to render or to offer performance is material, the following circumstances are significant. A. The extent to which the injured party will be deprived of the benefit which he reasonably expected. So as the injured party, the non-breaching party, you need to make the case to the court that the breaching behavior, the alleged breach, whether that's an action that the other party took that's against the contract, whether that's a failure to act or a failure to perfectly perform under the contract, that is costly to you, right? That you will be deprived of some important benefit that you expected to receive under this agreement. B. The extent to which the injured party can be adequately compensated for the part of that benefit of which he will be deprived. To some extent, this can cut a little bit of both ways. If the breaching party can say, yeah, that's right, I was in breach, but here's a fix that we can do then that will compensate you for my failure, then the court might be less likely to say, oh, well, then this is certainly material. On the other hand, if the injured party can't really be adequately compensated outside of full expectation damages, including perhaps, as we'll talk about later this semester, consequential damages in an expectation damages theory, then, right, a court might be more likely to deem the breach material. C. The extent to which the party failing to perform or to offer to perform will suffer forfeiture. We talked about that last chapter. This idea that if the breaching party, right, gets paid nothing more under the contract, that it would somehow be an inequitable loss to them. And frankly, I'd say parenthetically in C is this related idea of if one party, in this case the breaching party, is suffering forfeiture, is the non-breaching party getting a windfall if the breach is declared material. D. The likelihood that the party failing to perform or to offer to perform will cure his failure, taking into account all of the circumstances, including any reasonable assurances. So if the injured party has notified the breaching party that they're in breach, and the breaching party attempts to cure, gives reasonable assurances that they will cure, right, then at that point, right, the non-breaching party cannot just unilaterally declare, nope, you don't get an opportunity to fix this. I'm not going to cut you any slack. You are in breach. It's a material breach. We end things now, and I'm going to go and seek full expectation damages. Courts are reluctant to do that. The idea in contract is that you are supposed to give notice of defect and give the party an opportunity to cure it. And then E, the extent to which the behavior of the party failing to perform or to offer to perform comports with standards of good faith and fair dealing. And this is, again, looking at the facts of the case. How is the breaching party behaving? If they're intentionally breaching, if they're trying to hurt the injured party, that's going to be a very different scenario from some of the ones that we've talked, like Jacobson Young v. Kent, where it seems as though the defect in performance is unintentional. It's not meant to hurt the other party. These are a lot of factors to consider. High level, it's looking at the behavior of the parties. Right? Is the party who's breaching deliberately not performing, even in a situation where it seems like they could perform? And this is all subject to the other doctrines we've been talking about this semester around excuse, around whether or not the other party thinks that they were brought into the contract under false pretenses. So all of our doctrines around duress and misrepresentation. Whether the party that's not performing feels like they're not performing because the contract is unconscionable. And so there's a lot to this, but R2K 241 gives you a framework for looking at a defect in performance and trying to argue to the court, this defect is so large, it's so great, it's not susceptible to being cured, this should be a material breach. Versus saying, yes, there's a defect, but the breaching party really was doing its best under the circumstances to perform. In which case, this probably shouldn't be considered a material breach. It should be something more akin to substantial performance under the contract. Right? If it's a material breach, the injured party can get expectation and related damages. If it's substantial performance, the basic measure there is the price the breaching party would have received under the contract, but with some offset. And we'll look at offsets in the Landis Builders case. Now, what happens if the cost to rectify the performance is really high? Right? That's largely the question that Landis case is looking at, and we'll talk about it in our group discussion. It depends. Sometimes courts say the full value of rectifying isn't the right offset, and so they might allow a different offset, like the diminution in market value based on the failure to perform. Other times the courts will allow the full offset, even if the defect doesn't impact the market value very much, and the offset ends up being really costly to the breaching party. Think about those options as you're reviewing the Landis case for class. We will talk about notice and cure in the context of the Raymondville versus Charlize Theron case in our class discussion. But some things to think about as you're reading this case: you can have within the contract guidelines for how to give notice, how long parties have to cure a defect. If you don't have that contractually, right, the court can imply those things into a contract as well, using some sort of reasonableness standard. But the key takeaway is you need to give the other party notice that they are in breach. Right? You have to do that before you can unilaterally declare that a contract has been breached, or at least you ought to. Otherwise you, as I discussed earlier, are in danger of being in breach of contract yourself. we will discuss offsets for substantial performance under a contract with our Landis case. So I want to just end this video with a quick discussion of this notion of a severable or divisible contract. And that is our Carrig Home Builders case on page 789. In this case, let's throw out some numbers just to give a sense of why the doctrine matters. Payment for each house under the contract in this subdivision that builder was supposed to be constructing, $4,000 each to the builder. Actual cost to build, $3,500 to the builder. So the builder was making $500 profit on each house. Builder constructs 20 houses, so they expect to be receiving $80,000 under their contract. But the builder then refuses to build the final 15 houses that were supposed to go into this subdivision. Right. So they have not fully completed their performance. They are in fact refusing to perform under their contract. The developer now is left with a barely half completed subdivision. Let's say the developer finds a new builder to construct the final 15 houses, but that new builder wants $5,000 rather than $4,000 to complete each house. That's $15,000 more than the developer expected to pay under their original contract. But the original builder comes in and says, well, pay me for the first 20 houses I built. What's the developer's reaction going to be? Why should I pay you, builder? You're in material breach of the contract. You are outright refusing to complete nearly half of what we agreed upon. And so that's where the parties are at here. And it does seem to be, under the circumstances of this case, and now I'm reading from the case itself, it appears from the report that the sole reason for the failure of the contractor to build the houses in question was that it insisted upon being paid an appreciably larger amount of money than was provided for by the contract if it should undertake the work and fully perform the contract. There was no error in finding that the contractor repudiated the contract without any legal excuse. So the court says builder repudiated, which means builder clearly in material breach of this contract. And it seems like the builder did it because they wanted more money. They wanted to make more of a profit. So why does it matter whether this contract is viewed as a whole? In which case, if that builder is in material breach, they should receive nothing under the contract, versus if the contract is viewed as a series of divisible or severable actions, each of which the builder could be paid for separately. So this is just some numbers to help you visualize it. If the contract is indivisible, then the builder could say, well, if I can't sue in contract, I can sue in unjust enrichment. And so I should get quantum merit for the houses that I actually built, right? Though offset, right, against the contractual damages that I'm going to owe the developer here. So that would be, recall it was 20 houses, $3,500 to build. That would have been $70,000, offset by the developer's expectation damages in contract. And so the builder would therefore receive $55,000 for the 20 houses that it did build. Now, is that what it expected to get under the contract? No, it's not. But why should the builder get expectation damages when they've committed a material breach? Interestingly, in Massachusetts, the court notes, it is a general rule that one who has breached an entire contract to be performed for an entire price cannot recover either on the contract or upon a quantum merit. All right. So the basic rule is that if we view this contract as a whole, in Massachusetts, if a party is declared to be in material breach, they're not even supposed to be allowed quantum merit for what they have performed. The court notes, however, but that where the contract consists of several and distinct items to be furnished or performed by one party, the consideration to be apportioned to each item according to its value and as a separate unit rather than a part of the whole, then the contract is severable or divisible. So just to reiterate, if this is an indivisible contract, if the court says we can't break this down into separate parts, separate units, then in Massachusetts, the builder would get no restitution at all. The builder would receive no money, and it would still owe the developer $15,000. Now, if it is divisible, right, if we can break this contract down into parts, then the builder is paid in full for the performance that it rendered. Right? So it would still receive the $80,000 less the expectation damages that the developer is getting, and the builder would receive $65,000. Right? So they're not getting the full measure of what they had originally contracted to get for those 20 houses. They're still being punished a little bit, the $15,000 that the developer had to pay extra, right? But the builder will still receive something. And the Massachusetts court explains it this way. The construction of each house and the payment therefore were mutual independent provisions of the contract. Right, so they broke it down into each house. We think the contract was a divisible one, and that the refusal of the contractor to construct the 15 houses included in the contract, which were in addition to the 20 houses erected by the contractor, did not bar the contractor from recovering the unpaid balance for work done and materials furnished in constructing the 20 houses. So in that case, in the Carrig case, the court does find that it's divisible and does find that the builder should have been paid for the houses that it did in fact build. It still owes damages for its breach, but it does get paid. Unlike if it had been indivisible, just the contract as a whole, in which case being in material breach would have meant the builder would get nothing. So thinking about this indivisible versus divisible or severable concept, we will talk during our discussion tomorrow about the Menorah Chapels at Milburn v. Needle case. So that's it for today. I'm looking forward to talking with you all tomorrow morning. Have a good night.